Hello, everyone. My name is Claudia Matos Avolesi. I'm a professor for the history of art at the University of Campinas and one of the organizers of the next CIHA World Congress Migrations, which will take place next August in Sao Paulo, Brazil. In the name of the CIHA Organization Committee, today I want to welcome you to the CIHA Pre-Congress Series, Art Worlds of Brazil, a program of 10 lectures created in collaboration with the Clark Art Institute to offer a comprehensive view of the rich and diverse art traditions of Brazil from the colonial period to contemporary art. Art Worlds of Brazil will offer an introduction to the main collections, historical sites, and artworks in the country, critically examined by local art historians specialized in different aspects of Brazilian visual culture. The lectures will be posted once a month for public access on the Clark and CIHA websites, and a closed webinar related to each lecture will be offered to the participants of CIHA World Congress in the week after the posting of each lecture. Whether you will take part in the CIHA World Congress in Sao Paulo next year or not, we hope that this program will encourage everyone to actively engage with the richness of the visual culture in Brazil and get to know a little more about the scholarship produced by local art historians on this material. Roberto was a professor for the history of art at the State University of Rio de Janeiro until 2018, when he was hired as professor at SMU Dallas, where he teaches today. He is a specialist in contemporary art and architecture of Brazil and on Afro-Brazilian and African art. Let's welcome Roberto Conduru.
Hi, people. Thank you, Claudia, for your kind presentation. Thank you, Clark and CIHA, for the opportunity to present to you some thoughts about African and Afro-Brazilian art collections in Brazil. I start remembering how people enslaved and forced to migrate to Brazil had to abandon their families, their lives, all their belongings to initiate another life on the other side of the Atlantic. And so they have to fight for freedom, to resist, and to reinvent their lives. One space, a very important institution in this resistance process, are the so-called terreiros, the religious communities. Here we are seeing the Ilha Cheia na Soca in Salvador, Bahia, northeast of Brazil. And we have to think that these institutions, they have their own practices of collecting, preserving, and exhibiting artifacts, special artifacts. Artifacts that we should call something in between things and beings, since they connect people to their deities. And so in many circumstances, we are not allowed to see them. Only initiated people are. But we can, in certain moments, in certain rituals, participate in the activities of these institutions and see some objects, some spaces, like here in the main hall of the Ilha Cheia na Soca, in which we have this crown representing Shango, the leading deity in these communities. In the same city, I want to highlight Ilha Cheia ou Poafonjá, probably the best institution for us to understand how they are much more than just a religious community. Certainly they have spaces to praise their deities like Shango, also the main one here, but also Osai and many others, but also to preserve some knowledge they brought from Africa and they kept maintained due to many links there were between these religious communities and West Africa up to the First World War. Here, they still produce a la carte kind of fabric they learned to produce in this context with the West African, the Bight of Benin. But they also have Western institutions like a school and a museum they called House of All Things was created by the guidance of Mãe Stella de Oxóssi, a former hostess of this community. And this museum shows objects with which they tell us about their stories. Objects that are not being used anymore in rituals, they are not active in the religious life, and now are used to talk about the story of Ilha Xelpo Fonja, but also about Afro-Brazilian religions in Salvador and Brazil. Here we see a showcase dedicated to Mãe Stella de Oxóssi with her books and some of her belongings. She was a leading figure in Salvador from mid-20th century up to recently. From Salvador, we moved to Rio de Janeiro, southeastern Brazil, to Ilha Omolu, a community which, under the guidance of Mãe Meninazinha de Oxum, has promoted many activities for the community, like workshops, has recorded a CD with religious traditional songs, and also created a memorial to Yadavina, her grandmother, and who was an important leadership in the religious community in Rio de Janeiro between 1910s and 1960s. In Rio, I have this sad remembrance of the Museu Nacional of Universidade Federal of Rio de Janeiro, the oldest museum in Brazil, who was destroyed by a fire in September 2018 and almost totally lost its collections, among which we had a very important collection of African objects constituted since the beginning of 19th century by gifts like this one, a throne gave to Prince João from Portugal by the King Adandoza from the Kingdom of Dahomey, currently Benin, but also artifacts collected through research and exchanges with other institutions, representing many regions and many social groups in Africa. They also had a special collection of Afro-Brazilian religious objects that were seized by the police in 1880s. It's important to remember that up to when Brazil became a republic in 1889, these religions were prohibited. And so the police had the power to interrupt their rituals, to seize their artifacts, and to imprison people. And this collection was a special one of the oldest of this type of materials. And unfortunately, it was almost totally destroyed. Now we have some remnants of these pieces, but it's something that unfortunately only these images, through these images, we can have access to it. Another important institution regarding this type of collection is the Museum of the Police in Rio de Janeiro, who has an important collection of seized objects collected since the end of 19th century up to mid-20th century. At this time, these religions were not anymore prohibited, but they were still persecuted. We could say that this persecution continues up to today. We have many communities being vandalized, and it's a sad fact about the social situation of this community in Brazil. But at that time, the problem is how these objects were presented as criminal evidences, among other criminal evidences, without the respect they deserve. And so we have to remember Mãe Meninazinha de Oxum, who we have already seen, and her campaign for more than 3 decades, a campaign called Free Our Sacred, with many activities, articles in the press, and finally, in the more recent years, due to a lot of changes in the Brazilian society, they managed to have access. Here we see them having access to these collections, and they are praying, they are singing, and now this collection is relocated and is in a shared custody in which people from religious communities participating in taking care of it. Here we see them signing the landing term last September, and now we started to have images of the pieces being restored and kept in a better way. In the same city, the Historical National Museum, in which we also have pieces seized by the police from these communities. Here we have a special one that appears in one of the first texts published here by the art critic Mario Barata about Black art in Brazil. At this moment, it's about to be published, a version of it in art in translation. And so we still have this species, but in most cases, we don't know where they come from because the police people who seized them had no concern about taking data relating these pieces. And there is also this problem that collections formed by these seizures are collections with the policeman minds governing it without any principles, and mainly not religious principles, governing the structure of these collections. In the same museum, we have some, among other items, we have many ones like documents, jewelry, artworks. I brought for you images from Cristiano Junior's series depicting people of African descent in Rio de Janeiro in 1860s. In the same city, we have the National Museum of Fine Arts, which in 1960s tried to include other cultural references and constituted an African art collection. It was bought by a diplomat, Gasparino Mata e Silva, and most part of its objects are from Yoruba groups in West Africa, what will be typical of more recent African collections in Brazil. Now I will talk about 2 special institutions. One is Museum of Black, inside the Church of Our Lady of Rosary and Saint Benedict of the Black Man, a church constituted by a brotherhood of people with African descent in colonial times, who got fired in 1967. And after that, they constituted a museum with objects from the brotherhood, but also objects brought by enslaved people who were fugitives, since the church was a kind of refuge for them, but also documents related to slavery in the region, and artworks and everything related to that. The other institution is the Institute of Research and Memory of Black People, and has a very interesting story. The Guimarães family was renovating their house in a neighborhood that in mid-20th century was called Little Africa. And while renovating their house, they found the remnants of some bodies and some iron glasses utensils, and they discovered archaeological site, the archaeological site of a cemetery, the cemetery of the New Black. They were called like that because they have died just after their arrival in Rio de Janeiro. And so they were not, so they were just buried. And so they discovered it. And nowadays they have a memorial to them and also a gallery in which they exhibit cultural and artistic exhibitions. Nearby, you have the Valongo Wharf that was active between 1811 and 1831. And that period, in between 500,000 and 1 million Africans landed in this wharf. Later, it was deactivated and so buried. And recently, in the renovation of this neighborhood, the wharf was unearthed in 2010 and I think 2005, sorry. And since then, there was a lot of archaeological research in this site. And nowadays, it's a UNESCO heritage site because it was one of the main ports in the Americas for landing of African people. Nearby, in this region called Little Africa in the past, you have the saltstone, a natural rock, who has this name due because it was a place in which salt was stored, but also newly arrived Africans waited there for the new future. And since then, it became a place of encounters of people with African descent. And I brought an image of a festivity there because it's still a neighborhood in which people meet to celebrate. In this neighborhood, the center of the Rio de Janeiro, you have this monument created by architect João Figueira Lima and anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro, who was the state cultural governor at that moment, and to celebrate Zumbi dos Palmares, the main Afro-Brazilian hero who guided people in a quilombo in 17th century, the biggest one and the longest-lasting one at that period that was destroyed at the end of 17th century. But since then has been a guidance for people with African descent and everybody in Brazil who thinks about freedom and anti-colonial actions. And to do this monument, instead of inventing an image for Zumbi, since his image is not known, they borrowed the image of one of the ether heads that are nowadays in the British Museum. From this monument, I go to another one in southeastern Brazil, Minas Gerais. And usually that image of Iemanjá, a water deity from Yoruba that is celebrated in Brazil, throughout Brazil, she used to be on the edge of the lagoon, but was constantly damaged, another sign of iconoclasm against the Afro-Brazilian religions. And so in 2006, they asked sculptor Jorge dos Anjos to produce this portal, and they installed the image inside the lagoon. And so now you have this frame for it, a frame in which you have signs and symbols of many orishas, many Afro-Brazilian deities. From southeast, we go up to north, to Amazonia, to Museu Paraense Emílio Gold, in which you have one of the most important African art collections in Brazil. Unfortunately, I don't have many images, just one, and an image of the catalog they have. And it was a donation for the museum in 1933, and it's a very special one because it has objects from many regions in Africa, what is very different from other African art collections in Brazil, which are more focused on Western Africa and particularly on Yoruba cultures, while here you had a broader representation. The question is that you have a long time that we don't see this collection being exhibited. Still in the northern part of Brazil, in São Luís do Maranhão, there is this museum called Cafua das Mercês, what we could translate as cavern or grave of mercy, and has its name because the building is one of the few still existing slave depots from colonial times. It was a place to store enslaved people. And recently it was renovated, and besides its building, the museum is interesting for its collection in the sense that in it we can see how it's important the documents, photographs, and other types of objects related to Afro-Brazilian religious communities in that region, but also recently acquired African pieces that are more important for this new moment in a new reconnection with Africa, more than if we think about them in relation to other collections in Europe and the US, because the principles governing the constitution of these collections are very, very different. The other photo shows the replica of a pillory in the city, many of them in which the enslaved people were punished, were destroyed during slavery, and especially after the end of it in 1888. And here we have a replica of it. From São Luís, we moved to Fortaleza, in northeastern Brazil, to see Museu Arthur Ramos, constituted with the collection constituted by Arthur Ramos, a physician who is considered one of the founders of anthropology in Brazil, who published in 1949 this text called Black Art in Brazil, who was already published in Art in Translation. And the museum has the collection he managed to acquire in his research, with pieces from terreiros, but also pieces seized by the police. And so it's a very interesting one. From Fortaleza, we moved to Recife, a very important city in the northeast of Brazil. And it's another museum who has a special collection seized by the police in that region. Recently, they renovated the exhibition. And what is interesting about this museum and the presentation is that the Afro-Brazilian religious objects are presented in the art circuit. Usually, these objects, or they are presented as criminal evidence, like in the past, or in anthropological collections, but here is probably the only case in which they are presented as art, something that put us to discuss the multiple possibilities of these objects, but also how our historians have not dedicated the proper time to address these types of collections. In the same city, we have the Abolition Museum that was created in 1950s to discuss the presence of Africans in Brazil, and had many problems throughout time to have a proper building to be open. It closed many times, and recently received this collection of African objects that is also very interesting, because these objects have been seized in airports in Brazil. And so they received it in 2016. And so it's an example of this new African art that is being traded globally nowadays due to an interest, more than centenary interest in this type of object. And for us, it's interesting because the purpose, the principles guiding this collection is very, very different from what you find in European and US and other museums. It's a collection that serves much more for the new links that Brazilians, and especially Afro-Brazilians, want to establish with Africa. Not by chance, this is a museum with a very active program. From Pernambuco, we moved to Alagoas, also a northeastern state, in which we have, in the Historical and Geographical Institute, we have a special collection of objects seized by the police in 1912. And this collection is interesting because this movement was guided not only by the religious persecution, but it resulted also in political disputes in that city, in that region. And so you have, besides the religious questions, you have political resonances in the collection. Also in Alagoas, you can visit the former Quilombo dos Palmares, which I mentioned before, the biggest and the long-lasting Maroon in Brazil, that was active for more than 1 century and was destroyed by the Portuguese colonizers at the end of 17th century, but kept in the memory of all Africans and people with African descent, and also the Brazilians who fight for freedom. And since 1980s, it became a national heritage site. They promote many activities, and it's a place to go and think about all this historical process, colonization, slavery, and all this fight for freedom. From Pernambuco, we moved to Bahia, probably the state most connected to Africa in Brazil. And we moved to Museu Afro-Brasileiro from Universidade Federal da Bahia. Also a very important one with many different collections. One of them is the African collection that was constituted in 1970s. And this is a very special one because it was conducted by Pierre Verger, a French photographer, ethnologist, and anthropologist. And it's certainly a collection focused in West Africa, mainly Yoruba cultures. And obviously is connected to all the links that existed between Bahia and Western Africa, the Bight of Benin, and was important in the formation of the terreiros, but also, as we are seeing, in the formation of these collections. A collection constituted by masks, by musical instruments, fabrics, and there are many stories about how Verger selected the pieces and how sometimes he wanted specific pieces and copies of specific objects. They also have a very important collection that is lended to the museum. Formerly it belonged to Estácio de Lima Museum, also a museum constituted by criminal evidence. And here we have pieces that were seized from the terreiros. But also, interesting, the Estácio de Lima Museum collected pieces from artists producing in mid-20th century. Here we see a piece from Aguinaldo Manuel dos Santos, a Xango, and from Mário Cravo Jr., an Exu. And so it's interesting because we can observe how that museum, although very problematic, based on racist knowledge and without many criteria, mixing many types of objects to record the criminality in the society, included the production of artists like this who were exhibiting in the Sao Paulo Biennial and other art forums. They also have an Afro-Brazilian collection that resulted from their own researches. And it's interesting to observe how they show them connecting the art production with pieces that come from the terreiro in a more open disposition and connection of these objects. One of the highlights of their collection is a group of panels produced by Caribe, an artist active in Bahia since mid-20th century. And these panels were commissioned for a bank in 1960s, and they represent the Afro-Brazilian religions. In the same city, nearby, you have the National Museum of Afro-Brazilian Culture, a museum who not always show exhibitions, and mainly temporary exhibitions, but worth a visit due to this iron fence created by artist J. Cunha, who worked for Carnival, and here he created a history of Ogun, the deity of knowledge and war, depicting the life in Africa, the Middle Passage, the suffering of slavery, but also the victory over it. Also nearby, we have another depiction of Zumbi, the main hero of Afro-Brazilians. Also in Salvador, there is Museu Carlos Costa Pinto, who among many items related to life in Bahia, has a special collection of Creole jewelry or Afro-Brazilian jewelry, which is known as that because since 18th century, many enslavers used it to make their slaves dress those jewelry, special ones that mix references from Africa and Europe and the Americas. And this museum is the one who has the biggest and most comprehensive collection of this Creole jewelry. and certainly worth a visit when you go there. They have some publications also, and sometimes it's exhibited, and it's very, very special. In the same city, we have the Pierre Verger Foundation with all the photographs produced by Verger, who was a photographer, an ethnologist, and an anthropologist, and who made many researches in Africa, but also in Brazil, besides traveling throughout the world. And so you have photos from many parts of the world, but his collections are very, very special in relation to Afro-Brazilian culture, Afro-Brazilian religions, and its connections with Africa. Still in Bahia, in Salvador, there is the Museum of Modern Art, which was installed in an old manor, from whose collection I brought some highlights by Aguinaldo Manuel dos Santos depicting Oxóssi, the hunter deity, from Rubem Valentim, who created a special series for Oxalá in his research trying to connect European constructivism to the geometrical knowledge that was produced in the Afro-Brazilian religions, and also the work, a monument from Master Didi, who was raised in Ilhéa Cheopó-Funjá, which we have seen. He was the son of one of the most famous priestesses, Mãe Senhora, and he learned with Africans how to produce scepters for Orishas, Obaluaê, Nanã, and since the 1960s, he transposed what was his production for the religious realm to the artistic realm. Also in the same city, he created this earth scepter, also in a connection with the other side of the Atlantic, with Africa. From this scepter, I moved to this monument, a kind of totem, the syncretic mark of Afro-Brazilian culture that Valentim created for Sao Paulo in southeastern Brazil, 1970s. And from here, I moved to the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology of Sao Paulo University, now being renovated. And I brought some old images because they have a special collection constituted by historians and anthropologists, Mariano Carneiro da Cunha, Kabengele Munango, Marta Heloísa Leuba Salum, and others. With research in Africa, they have a special collection of African jewelry that was constituted by Carneiro da Cunha in mid-1970s. And since then, they try to structure a collection and an exhibition representing certain cultures of Africa. In Sao Paulo Cultural Center, there is an important collection of artifacts seized by the police in Pernambuco, northeastern, but who were brought to Sao Paulo by writer and intellectual Mário de Andrade in 1930s. And recently there was this exhibition created by Alexandre Araújo Bispo, and they have this collection that can be consulted, and it's very important because it's one of the still existing of this type of objects in Brazil. In Sao Paulo, which is known for its building and special European art collection, recently received a donation by Obilota, the family, and they have now this special collection, not acquired like many ones we have seen in the direct connection with Africa, but one constituted in auction houses and with pieces more certificate in the traditional markets of African art. But to conclude, I will highlight the Museu Afro-Brazil, who was created by artist, editor, curator, and museum director Emanuel Araújo from Bahia, but who went to live in Sao Paulo. And after a large experience editing volumes, curating temporary exhibitions, and being the director of Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo, he created in 2004 this museum dedicated to Afro-Brazilian culture. And so here we have an African art collection, one of these constituted recently, directly in Africa and in other places, but with more recent objects and more focused on the cultural relations between people with African descent in Brazil and people in Africa. He also created this installation of the slave ship, which is the core of the museum, and from which you depart to see artifacts used in the enslavement process. You can see artworks from Jorge dos Anjos, from whom we have seen the Portal of Memory in Belo Horizonte, and here we have some totems and columns, but you also find art objects from other artists, the popular religiosity since colonial times, and outfits like this one from Mãe Olga de Alaqueto from Bahia, which the institution presents since she passed away. And also another installation, a very interesting one, also created by Emanuel Araújo, an artist, a sculptor. And this one is interesting because you can observe here the altar to Shango, the deity of justice. You see many coins that the people throw for the deity. And so this museum is very special because although it presents art, it presents documents, it's not a historical museum only, it's not only an artistic museum, it's a cultural museum in which the public also have this desire to pray and to throw coins, to ask for blessings from the deities. And it's interesting to connect this installation with this crown to one we've seen previously at the beginning of my talk at Casa Branca do Engenho Velho. You remember the Ile Axé Yana Soka, with which I started my presentation and talking about how these institutions have their own ways of collecting, preserving, and exhibiting. And here it's interesting how Emanuel Araújo connects the museum with the terreiro, and how both institutions are one and the other dialoguing. And I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of this relation between museums and terreiros in Brazil nowadays, and with which we can, who knows, produce a new type of knowledge, and certainly one who is more fair and in which people with African descent, but not only them, can have a better experience, a better understanding of what was colonialism, what was enslavement, and what is the continuous fight for freedom. Thank you very much.